Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the Black Death. This first episode, The Sailing of the Plague Fleets, will talk about how the medieval warm period led to fast growth in European agriculture, which in turn led to fast growth in European trade. However, these European traders soon came into contact with merchants from Central Asia, which is where the plague originated. After spreading through Asia, the plague came to Europe when the Mongol Khans laid siege to the Italian colonial city of CAFFA on the Black Sea coast. When the Mongols brought the plague there, the Italian residents of CAFFA tried to flee, but their plague-ridden fleets only spread the disease first into Constantinople, then throughout the Mediterranean, and finally back to Italy. Beginning in the 900s, the Earth saw an upturn in world temperatures called the medieval warm period. Even northern Europe enjoyed an almost Mediterranean climate. The population doubled. Vast fields of grain brought bread onto more tables. Good weather made it easy to grow surplus crops. Soon peasant wives were able to devote free time to handicrafts, and their husbands were able to sell them and thus join the cash economy. More and more peasants could count on coming into a bit of land for themselves and their heirs. All of this changed abruptly with the coming of the Little Ice Age. It first made itself known in the terrible summer of 1315 when angry walls of rain smashed open dikes, which spilled out huge amounts of water that washed away whole villages. Farmland was buried under sprawling shallow lakes. Poorer peasants had no choice but to abandon their land, taking refuge from the rain under trees and bowers. Once fertile farmland became choked with weeds, and the price of food skyrocketed. As livestock began to die off for lack of fodder, the peasants themselves starved. The heavy rains continued through 1317, and agriculture did not recover until 1322. By that time, close to 10% of Europe had died, somewhere between 6 and 8 million people. Those who survived into adulthood were weaker and sicklier and more likely to die of the plague when it came. Though the peasants were starving and sickly, the rich could still reap the benefits of early globalization. Italian merchants established trade outposts in the Levant and whole cities on the Black Sea coast. CAFFA, located on the Crimea, became home to 70,000 people from a dozen countries. There you could encounter Arab merchants who were trading precious stones and Chinese silks, and Russian merchants who were trading blonde-haired Ukrainian slaves and timber. However, all of those silks and precious stones came to CAFFA through the Silk Road, which went through Central Asia. The Gobi Desert is often given as a possible origin point for the Black Death, along with Lake Issyk in Siberia, both of which are stopping points on the new Silk Road. The plague itself was a bacteria in the digestive system of fleas that lived on rats. The plague periodically erupted in these near-empty areas of Central Asia and Siberia, but because of a lack of animal life to sustain it, the plague always faded just as fast. Indeed, the plague's natural prey was rats, marmots, squirrels, and other rodents. When humans did not travel to Central Asia, these rodents died lonely, harmless deaths in sand dunes or the tundra. Yet when Central Asian merchants began to travel through these foci, they picked up bubonic fleas and carried them into China, Persia, India, all of the world's great population centers. Before the Black Death came to Europe, it was an Asian tragedy. As many as 120 to 160 million people died across Asia in the first 3 or 4 decades of the 14th century. China alone may have lost as many as 40 or 50 million people to the plague. Given that the world's population was only 500 million at the time, the Black Death ranks as the greatest catastrophe in human history, killing somewhere between 33 and 40% of the human population on Earth. That would be the equivalent of 2 or 3 billion people dying today. Though the plague had not come to Europe yet, merchant caravans had brought stories about great mortalities to the east, but for now they were just stories to the people of CAFFA. Of far greater concern to the Genoese masters of CAFFA were the Mongol Khans. Indeed, they only held CAFFA as a grant from the Mongol Empire, the largest land state the world ever saw. To the Mongol Khans, who ruled an empire stretching from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, CAFFA was barely worth thinking about. But in 1314, some Italian merchants and local Muslims got into an argument over a bad trade. Insults were exchanged, fists were waved, stalls were tipped over, and finally a knife flashed. That knife went into the stomach of a Muslim. Khan Janabek, a self-proclaimed defender of Islam, ordered CAFFA to give up the killers for Mongol justice and to give up the city's self-government. When the Italians refused, the Khan laid siege to CAFFA throughout the year 1346. When the Mongols began dying of the Black Death, the Genoese offered prayers of thanksgiving to God for smiting the heathen army. According to local lore, Khan Janabeg then brought the plague to Europe by catapulting plague-ridden corpses over the CAFFA wall. However, that may have been invented by Europeans to blame the plague on devious heathens. More likely, the plague simply came into CAFFA by infected rats that had traveled with the Mongol encampment. Whatever the case, both the Mongols and the Europeans in CAFFA suffered horribly from the Black Death. By April 1347, CAFFA's streets were filled with feral animals feeding on human corpses. All order broke down. Drunken soldiers looted buildings and assaulted women with impunity. Old women searched ruined buildings for loved ones. Burning buildings poured columns of smoke into the Crimean sky. Worst of all, swarms of rodents with staggering gaits and bloody froth pouring from their snouts crawled through the streets in hordes. The fleas carrying the plague were killing the rats, and soon those fleas would look for human hosts. When the flea bit a human being, that person would have 2 to 6 days before an egg-shaped boo-boo grew on their abdomen or thigh if they were bitten on the lower body, or the underarms and neck if they had been bitten on the upper body. These bobos created strange deformations. Thigh bobos led to hopping limps. Underarm bobos led to raised arms, and neck bobos led to heads always cocked this way or that. Then bruise-like splotches began to appear on the chest and back, meaning that the victim had a fatal case of the plague. From there, the victim's flesh literally began to rot away. One of the main reasons why plague victims were often abandoned by their families was because nobody could bear the stench of the rotting flesh. And as the victim's light was snuffed out, they would either start raving and screaming from the windows, or they would fall into a silent stupor before they died. The CAFFA Wharf by April 1347 became a scene of pandemonium. Surging crowds poured onto the ships. Guards swung swords and clubs to keep the mobs from capsizing the vessels. Merchant princes and their once plump wives and daughters brawled for a spot on ships. The lucky few who escaped CAFFA soon learned that they were not so lucky. Rats had escaped on the ship with them, and they brought the plague fleas with them. As the plague spread on the ships, captains kept order with beatings and floggings. They would strap plague-stricken helmsmen to the wheel, tied carpenters to their benches, and lashed riggers shaking with fever to the mast. If the captains died, or if they ran out of rope, delirious sailors would be wandering the decks, their canvas trousers stained by leakage. Some of the crews became so weak that they couldn't even throw the dead overboard. Plague corpses just rolled around the decks of ships until they hit a rail and burst open, spraying pus and putrefaction across the already filthy decks. The dismal fleet came through Constantinople in the summer of 1347. The seat of the East Roman emperors was soon stricken by the Black Death. Throughout the summer and fall, the Romans brought out their dead for burial by the hundreds. Whole neighborhoods emptied. For fear of the contagion, fathers refused to bury sons, and sons ignored their final duties to their fathers, leaving the dying to face the yawning chasm of eternity alone. Among the dead was Imperial Prince Andronicos, 13-year-old son of Emperor Johannes IV. The emperor was so grieved by his son's death that he abandoned the purple and became a monk to pray and mourn for the rest of his life. Even worse, more plague ships began fleeing Constantinople to flee the Black Death, which meant that the Genoese plague ships were now joined by Roman plague ships. Some of these vessels eventually made their way to Cyprus, where, of course, the plague immediately began to spread. There, Christian Cypriots owned a great many Arab slaves who worked in their olive tree plantations. The Christian Cypriots accused their Arab slaves of poisoning the wells in a scheme to regain their freedom. Cypriots dying of the plague herded hundreds of Muslim men, women, and children into olive groves already ruined by slashing rains. Among the green fetid puddles and twisted trees, the Cypriots slaughtered hundreds of their slaves. Of course, this did nothing to save themselves, and soon the Cypriots who had not died of the plague simply joined the Genoese and East Roman plague fleets that were already spreading the contagion through Europe. In Sicily, the rhythms of life continued as they had for generations. Fishermen loaded their catch, farmers tended their olive trees, and children played on golden beaches. Then the plague ships brought the pneumatic strain of the Black Death, and just the same as in Cyprus, panic broke out and all order broke down. People fled the cities, and the roads choked with dusty refugees. Sick stragglers staggered off to the woods to die. In Catalan, people blamed the Jews for the plague and murdered hundreds of them. Refugees from the south of Sicily poured into Catania, where they surrounded the cathedral and begged for the relics of Saint Agatha. In time, the city patriarchs gave them holy water, which the relic had been dipped into, so they could sprinkle it on their afflicted villages. Duke Giovanni of Sicily showed far less courage than his patriarchs. He fled into the woods, hoping to avoid death by the plague, living as a hermit among the trees. But of course, the plague eventually found him, and Duke Giovanni of Sicily died a lonely, miserable death. By autumn 1347, the plague ships began to limp into Genoa, back home in Italy. Genoese authorities put together the city's fleet to stop the plague ships from coming into the city, sending them off to die elsewhere. Another plague fleet arrived in December, driven away by flaming arrows fired from the city's stone walls. However, this time, the authorities acted too late. The plague spread fast in Genoa. Like other medieval cities, it was a breeding ground for disease. Pigs, chickens, geese, and cattle freely roamed the streets. The roads themselves were further befouled by urine and feces that were thrown from chamber pots. Dead animals killed the night before by feral dogs were left to rot in the summer sun so that rats would eat their meat and children would take their bones to make toys. Butchers slaughtered animals outdoors, leaving guts to molder in the sun. Barber surgeons poured blood drawn from their patients into the dirt streets. All of this didn't just make the medieval city dirty, it made it seem like a charnel house or a battlefield. The plague came into Genoa, and helped along by terrible sanitation, it caused the deaths of 30,000 of the city's 80,000 inhabitants. Laborers died as easily as merchant princes. A lone hero from this nightmare was a notary named Antonio de Benito, who wrote wills for the dying, exposing himself to the plague, which ultimately took his life. While Antonio's work was not glamorous, his labor ensured the orderly transfer of wealth to survivors and gave hope that life would continue after the plague. However, Europe would need much more than hope to survive. Genoa was only the first mainland community to suffer from the plague. Europe's agony had only begun. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.